So I met Lynn just about 2 years ago, environmental evolution, like so many other people here. At the same time as I was taking environmental evolution, I was taking a molecular evolution class by the person who had the lab right next to her. I didn't actually know a whole lot about any of that stuff at the time, but I was trying to make a eukaryotic phylogeny, or a phylogeny of all eukaryotes. And so I decided to ask Lynn about this. And it turns out that that was poking a wasp nest. There was something there that I didn't understand, but I could get Lynn riled up just asking questions about organisms I had never heard of, knew nothing about, and she loved it. She loved explaining it to me and gave me the references I needed to continue to do that. That turns out not to be a good strategy to get a good grade in a class about molecular phylogeny, of course, but so be it. It ended up getting me a job in the lab, and that was pretty much the rest is history. I only knew her for like 2 years, but it's really quite interesting that people who've known her for decades would say something about her, and I would recognize the exact same thing. She was who she was, and it came across no matter how long you knew her. It really was something special. That's it.
I'm Bruce Scofield. I met Lynn in 1999 at a multi-author book signing event at the Hitchcock Center in Amherst. And we were sitting next to each other. Me in front of my stack of hiking guides that I'd written, and she with a stack of her science books. And I didn't know who she was. I'd never heard of her. But we struck up a conversation, found we had a common interest in hiking the entire 120-mile Metacomet Monadnock Trail, now known as the New England Scenic Trail. And we both found we needed a partner with a separate car to hike each linear section. So we began this project hiking about 7 or 8 miles at a time every few weeks. Walking and talking was definitely our thing. And I found her insights, scientific and social, fascinating. And with my background in geology, astronomy, history, and philosophy, our conversations were wide-ranging and very intellectually stimulating. Now, what this talk really is about, what I have to say, is just kind of a testimony to Lynn's intellectual honesty. So about 2 months into this walking and talking relationship we had established, I told her that while I had studied all these subjects at Rutgers and had a BA and a master's degree in history, I'd actually spent more time in the past 30 years studying astrology. I waited for one of the standard responses: dismissal, attack, or silence. She just said, "I don't know anything about it. Do you believe in it?" I said, "Well, that's not the right question." I said, "Do you believe in everything there is in biology?" She said, "Of course not. But is it science?" I replied, "I believe science is the best method we have for producing useful knowledge, and it can be and has been applied to the subject matter of astrology." And then she asked me this question. Here we go. What is it? How can it be tested? And this is kind of a in-lab joke about how she would meddle with our PowerPoints. And what have you learned? And I said, this is what I learned. That it is you can find mapping techniques for dynamic systems in it, and you can find measuring tools for the temporal environment within which evolution occurs. And Lynn liked my careful and critical approach to this neglected and abused area of inquiry. A few months later, she recruited me. I took her signature course in environmental evolution and began the long haul towards my PhD, what she called my union card, and became her teaching assistant. We agreed on a research question, a test of one of Kepler's assertions about the influence of Saturn on the Earth's atmosphere, and I began to study whatever I could find in the scientific literature that related to cosmic influences on the biosphere: circadian cycles, lunar cycles, solar cycles, orbital cycles, and it turned out to be a very productive and ongoing investigation. Over the following years, Lynn liked to test her fellow scientists by telling them she had a grad student that studies astrology. She was particularly interested in the reactions of those who would, in her words, become apoplectic upon just hearing the word. In a way, I think she used me as a tool for measuring others' scientific honesty and critical thinking. A few times she reported that a scientific colleague privately confessed to having a serious interest in the subject, but this was rare and none of them were wearing it on their sleeve, and I won't mention their names, as they may not want to come out of the closet as I just have, but they exist. Lynn was the first truly honest scientist I had met. She knew very clearly what she didn't know, and she never assumed anything just to please the status quo. She wanted to learn, not play the games of mammalian territorial politics. I am honored to have been her grad student and have been inducted into one of the best social experiences I've had in my life, the Margulis Lab, her other family. It's a wonderful collection of brilliant characters she has recruited, rescued, and assembled over the years. We will keep her spirit alive, and we'll go forward into the uncharted territory she saw as the real goal of scientific inquiry.
Hi. So just on a related note of what I'm going to say, I'm going forward right now in creating a web-based network composed of Lynn's students, colleagues, and friends to assist with peer review, publication assistance, writing assistance, job placement, seeking funding, etc., tentatively called the Lynn Margulis Symbiosis Network, and you can talk to me about it afterward if you want, but I'm going to be seeking out a lot of you, so when you get an email from Andre, it's probably not spam, I can't get it. All right, so I just want to talk about whenever somebody dies, everything they've done and been is taken up and made available to us in a new way. And that shift in thinking and perspective that loss bestows upon us gathers up the departed and turns them into a force. Now they can only live and think in this world through us. They become words, enthusiasm, discipline, a method of thinking, and a system for a measurement of doubt. And so I wanted to think about what had become available through Lynn's death. I'm going to cut out a bunch of the little stories that I had about her. But one I wanted to add because people haven't been talking about it. Lynn wasn't the sexless, nerdy scientist stereotype that we have. She was a very passionate and also sensual person, and she wrote about sex all the time. And I remember once, aside from the fact that we talked about men all the time, which is probably why we got along very well, once mid-sentence in class, she stopped and looked at me and said, "Andre, mi amore," in the middle of class, total non sequitur. And then she said very quickly, "Do you know what that means?" So she showed us affection and she corrected us, love and accuracy. She was also very concise. We used to dread this clock that had a red light on it, which, Sean, you are that red light on the clock today. I hope that would go off after 5 minutes. You had to be quick, so I'm making this quick. When death is a critical moment for the individual human being because their oneness or the invisible membrane that binds their personality together dissolves, and the singular permanently becomes the many. When I was standing on the level looking down the escalator at people coming in and out of the campus center auditorium, I kept expecting to see Lynn walk out. Thinking she'd be wearing one of those funny vests that she wore. When I walked down the escalator and I listened all day yesterday and when I met with many of you, some for the first time, and the feeling became gradually more understandable to me, I wasn't expecting her, I was actually identifying her. She's speaking through our mouths, she thinks through our thoughts, and she writes in our words, which is not a bad thing to happen for someone who is so in love with nestled hierarchies and beings made out of other beings, organisms made out of other organisms. So because she can no longer be one, she does not live on as an individual, but as a being still, but made up of our actions, our behaviors, and our thoughts. We want to know wherever you are, Lynn, well, it is here, it is us. No longer corporeal, she's made up of ephemera, of the things that we do and say and think. So I'm so honored, and I think we're all honored now to be a part of the symbiosis of thinking, feeling, and willing that now makes up Lynn. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, I'm Betsy PalmerEldridge, and I'm glad to sort of help wind up this. I quite probably knew Lynn longer than anyone here. She and I was born 3 months after her in line in the University of Chicago hospitals, and we were classmates there in the primary school, in the lab school at the U of C. And for some reason, we were best friends then. Now, whatever causes little children of that sort this high to choose another little child to be their best friend? But whenever the class had to line up 2 by 2, Lynn and I always lined up, and I can well remember her being at my 8th birthday party, which was an overnight, and we made ourselves up as Indians afterwards. We had a lot of good times together. At any rate, whatever that attraction, as years went on, of course, we were terribly busy off doing other things, but we did manage to keep up with each other a little. Of course, Lynn was, I saw her, for instance, once we ended up in Boulder, Colorado together one summer, and I went over to have dinner with her, and she was busy cooking dinner, and there was this little toddler in and out of a high chair, and I'm sure it was Dorian, and there was this great lump in the corner who must have been Carl Sagan. And I was just sort of like this. I said, good Lord, what has happened to my friend Lynn Alexander? You know, she could amount to nothing. She's gone down the drain. Well, it's been fascinating for me the last day or so to see what she has done in the meanwhile. She obviously didn't go down the drain. And it's been very busy. But as I said, both of us were busy. We both had families, and I had a family too. And we were both trying in and out of those responsibilities to carry on with our careers, our professional interests. In my case, hers was science, clearly, as we all know. In my case, I was trained in Germany and France as a book pioneer and became a conservator of rare books and manuscripts and archival materials, which is what I've done for 55 years. And it's a very similar sort of a thing. We have meetings and honors and all this type of thing. At any rate, Lynn and I have kept up with each other. Most recently, she was in Toronto a year or so giving a talk at York University, and then at our house, and we went out to her talk, and it was fascinating to see. But we would often meet up at the reunions out there in Chicago at the lab school. And at one of them not too long ago, a few years ago, Lynn suggested that we would co-author a paper. And it turns out that she's quite fascinated by my grandfather, who was someone named Howard Taylor Ricketts, who discovered the Rickettsia microorganism, the bipolar microorganism that causes typhus and Rocky Mountain spotted fever. And what fascinated Lynn was she thought it was so terribly important that scientists not be put up on pedestals, that it be clearly pointed out that they were human beings that had another life and foibles and so on. So she suggested that at one reunion, and we quite forgot about it until we showed up again at another reunion a number of years later. Thought it was a good idea and decided we would, so we did. We wrote that paper, and it was eventually published in the ASM, and I think Celeste was in on it big time as well. And it was a lot of fun. And I won't go into all those stories because Howard Taylor Ricketts died in Mexico City of typhus as he was working on the disease in 1910. And although none of us, of course, knew him, we weren't born in, but we had a lot of family stories about exactly who and what he was. And so we tried to work that into the whole article story of it. And what Lynn was so anxious to do was to prove that he, although he was a fine scientist, was also a fine fellow. And the reason I came over this weekend is I just wanted to reassure you all that even though Lynn was a fine scientist, she was also a fine friend. Only I'm a little bit miffed she went off and died. I fully look forward to having many more years.
Mostly I want to thank Celeste, the lab, Mark, Geosciences. They sort of welcomed me into this world for a little bit to work on Lynn's materials. I worked on them in the house. I thank the family. I have a funny story to tell. I can't pass it up. So a lot of times I'd have dinner at Lynn's house. Dorian would be there. And one day, I'll read it because I sort of didn't write down a lot of the exchanges that we had. I wish I had, but I wrote this on my Facebook page. September 2nd, 2008. Dorian Sagan is on day 2 of a hunger strike to stop maternal injustice. He's really just fasting, but he thinks hunger strike sounds macho. He claims that he will not eat until his mother, Lynn Margulis, stops rephrasing questions, answers as questions, and stops asking questions when she's in another room and expect him to answer. I emailed him a couple days later, And I wrote, September 4th, 2008, Dorian has given up fasting/striking. His mother never met any of his demands. He said her only response was, everything's always my fault. And one of the things I loved about Lynn was she apologized for anything. She would always say, I'm sorry, but just do it. But I'm supposed to talk about poetry today a little bit. And Lynn loved Emily Dickinson. And I met Lynn through Alice Sheffy, another poet. And I was influenced by Emily Dickinson as well and Lynn in writing. And one of the things I'm going to say is that Dickinson's poems are very unstable. They use slant rhyme, they have internal rhyme, dissonance, alliteration, and so you never feel quite comfortable when you read them or you hear them. And Lynn was the same way. You know, you never really, she didn't make you feel comfortable. She took risks. And I'm just going to read this Emily Dickinson poem. Lynn did a garden tour of the homestead in 2004. I came up for it. And she would go to different parts of the yard and the garden and the house and read a particular poem that moved her, I guess, from the homestead. And this was one of the ones she chose for that day. I want to say that the he in the poem is grass, and it has sort of a bittersweet ending, but I'm imagining this poem as something that Lynn would be in conversation with Emily. So even though the end is a little sad, I think it's okay. What else do I have to say? I don't really know that much about Emily Dickinson, and I just, but I know that Lynn loved her deeply, and that poetry isn't always something to be understood, but it's something that you let wash over you. With that, what mystery pervades a well? That water lives so far, a neighbor from another world, residing in a jar, whose limit none have ever seen, but just his lid of glass, like looking every time you please in an abyss's face. The grass does not appear afraid. I often wonder. He can stand so close and look so bold at what is awe to me. Related somehow they may be. The sedge stands next the sea, where he is floorless and does no timidity betray. But nature is a stranger yet. The ones that sight her most have never passed her haunted house, nor simplified her ghost. To pity those that know her not is helped by the regret that those who know her less, the nearer her they get. Thank you.
Emily Dickinson said, "Tell all the truth, but tell it slant. Success in circuit lies, too bright for our infirm delight. The truth's superb surprise, as lightning to the children, eased by explanation kind. The truth must dazzle gradually, or every man be blind."